Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to see you all. We are glad that you have joined us for our webinar on the experience of heat pump installers and customers in Vermont. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kara Robichek. I'm the Deputy Director and Network Manager at Energy Action Network. And as the briefest of intros, EAN is a network of hundreds of public sector, nonprofit, utility, business, and higher education partners working collaboratively to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments. The network is supported by our small staff who work together to support Vermont in making evidence-based energy and climate decisions grounded in high-quality data and analysis and collaboratively developed for effective and durable progress. We are a non-advocacy group and we do not lobby for any specific outcomes. But we do bring people together to share information and discuss various topics. And so we're very glad to be talking about heat pumps today. Just to sort of situate us, this is the third in a series of webinars on heat pumps. In February, we had a webinar on what do we know about heat pump installation and use in Vermont and the region. And then in March, we had a second webinar on how to improve heat pump installation and use in Vermont. I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen those webinars, that you go back onto our website and you watch them. But I'm going to give the briefest of highlights from each of those two as we get started. So in the first webinar, we heard from Efficiency Vermont about their heat pump market assessment that they did in March and released in March of 2025. And some of the highest level takeaways from that is that customers do report high satisfaction with heat pumps, but there are adoption barriers that include high upfront costs, limited contractor availability, and outdated housing infrastructure. And they also said that targeted efforts are needed to overcome technical and behavioral barriers for year-round heat pump use. Okay, we also in that webinar heard from the Vermont Public Service Department about their cold climate ductless heat pump 2024 and 2025 impact evaluation results. And those results showed that compared to their previous modeling assumptions, their evaluation found that ductless heat pumps are being used for heating less than they had expected, less than they had modeled. They're being used for cooling more than they had expected. They're sometimes not efficiently sized, and that all of those things together mean that there are some higher costs than they had originally modeled and predicted. There was some other really great information in that webinar. So again, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at that if you have a chance. Then in our second webinar, we heard from Efficiency Vermont again and their Vermont Heat Pump Action Plan recommendations, which were released in March of 2026. And those recommendations, some of the high-level takeaways were that there needs to be more consumer education of both consumers who already have heat pumps and those who are considering installing them. Contractor engagement on best practices and financial incentives for whole system design and fossil fuel offset is needed. And they need more whole home rebates to incentivize whole home projects and to continue support for the most efficient units. In all, there's some really impressive numbers in the state. There's almost 83,000 heat pumps installed since Efficiency Vermont started its rebate program. 10% of housing units in Vermont have a heat pump and 20% of single family homes. And there's more than 200 Efficiency Excellence Network contractors who are installing these units. So those are some of the big numbers. And I am now going to pass over to my colleague, Jared Duvall, to give a little bit more of the context.
Thanks, Kara. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our panelists and hand it back over to Kara for questions of them, our panelists had asked if we could set some context with some of the most recent EAN analysis that we're really happy to provide a sneak preview of for everybody on this webinar today. Some of what I'm going to share very briefly comes from our forthcoming 2026 annual progress report. And some of this comes from analysis that we've been doing for a series of blog posts looking at how fossil fuel price increases since the start of the war in Iran have been affecting Vermont and Vermonters. So this first one is an updated graph that looks at heating fuel prices over time. This is really relevant because we look at those bottom three lines for fossil gas, heat pumps and wood pellets, and we see a much greater degree of price stability over the last 15 plus years than we do in those generally much higher cost and much more price volatile lines that represent propane in gray and fuel oil in purple. And this is standardized in terms of the cost per delivered unit of heat per million BTUs. And you can see um, all of this data goes through at least March, some through April, and you can see the recent spike in fuel oil costs in the past couple of months there at the end, the right-hand end point of that purple line for fuel oil. Next slide, please. So bringing this down to a household level, what does that cost increase for fuel oil, which is still um, the most commonly the kind of plurality of heating fuel use at the residential level in Vermont, what those price increases have meant. So for a household that is refilling a standard sized fuel oil tank, which is often about 275 gallons, maybe a fill up is 200 gallons. It's over $300 more expensive in April than it was at the end of February before these price spikes began. So really, really significant cost effects for household and business and anybody else's budgets that are relying on fuel oil. Next slide, please. This is a graph that we put together to help illustrate both the average cost over the last 5 years, which is shown in the blue dots, of these different heating options, the heating fuel sources. And then the orange bars show the annual range in each of those years, 21 through 2025. And so that's another way that we can see this volatility, that not only are we seeing higher on average costs for fuel oil and propane, but also the much greater price volatility leading to a greater annual range of costs on the right there. And then this is something that we've been working on to help explain why we see some of the cost differentials between heat pumps and other sources of heating on the left and cooling on the right. And a part of it is the efficiency of the unit. So on the left-hand side, you can see air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps in those taller green bars, their average coefficient of performance over the heating season as compared to the efficiencies of the combustion-based heating systems on the left. Of course, there's variation in those heat pump units depending on the outdoor temperature, but those are averages over the season. And then on the right-hand side, we're going to talk about not just the heating of heat pumps, but also the cooling, and there's an efficiency advantage there as well, although not quite as stark as compared to central or window AC units. Next slide. And then on this cooling side, this is pretty appropriate for today's very hot and humid day. We've also been tracking data from NOAA, Burlington International Airport's weather station, looking at the number of extreme heat days that we see in Vermont. And over the last 65 years, that has increased by about 155% if you follow that trend line. Of course, there's variation, but in the last 5 years, every year we've experienced more than 20 extreme heat days in Vermont. So cooling is becoming increasingly important. So those are our 5 quick slides to share some context. And now we get to the main event, which is hearing from our guest speakers who Cara is going to pose some questions to. We're going to hear from Nick Papaseraphim, who is the owner of Vermont Energy Contracting and Supply Corporation, often known as Vermont Energy. They are a leading installer of heat pumps in the state of Vermont. And then we're also going to hear from Shannon Bryant, who's the program director of Energy Navigators, which was started by the Climate Economy Action Center of Addison County, often known as CEAC. We'll also hear from Ken Jones, who retired from working for the state of Vermont at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development as economic research analyst, and has many volunteer roles, including as an EA and senior fellow, and as an expert and very careful user and tracker of his heating systems, which include wood pellets and heat pumps. And we'll also hear from Charlie Wilner, who is the Director of Energy Services for Evernorth, which is a nonprofit organization that is serving low and moderate income folks in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont with affordable housing and community investments. So, Nick, Shannon, Ken, and Charlie, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. And over to you, Cara.
Yeah, thanks. I'm stopping sharing slides so that we can see each other a little bit better. So how we're going to run this is I'm going to ask questions of each of those presenters, and we'll go back and forth a little bit that way. At the very end, we'll have some time for your questions if there's some questions you want to put in the chat as well. I'm going to start by asking a question of Nick. So Nick, you are a business owner of a company that installs many heat pumps in Vermont. What can you tell us about how the industry is changing and how heat pump technologies are changing and what the challenges and opportunities are in this line of business?
Sure. Thanks. So I'm honored to have been asked to join you guys today. I come to the industry as of 4 years ago, and kind of had a clean slate to it. So my observations come from that time. There has been a lot of change in the last year, in particular. So there's from a technology standpoint, there was the change in refrigerants. And an improvement in terms of moving on to some refrigerants that have lower global warming potential, which is great. But that certainly has also created some challenges in that transition. And then one of the major other challenges or other changes was the elimination of the Inflation Reduction Act, which expired in 2025. And so that's kind of thrown a major change because there was certainly some governmental subsidies for these projects that has disappeared. So those are, just in the last several months here. So 2025 was a big change, and 26 is a transition year as we kind of embark on and dealing with those. One of the other major changes I guess I'd like to bring forth too is over the last few years, the increase in cost for equipment. And there's a lot of theories that have been thrown out as to what might be causing that, including the change in refrigerant, and some of the additional efforts associated with that for sensors, for safety, and things of that nature. And at the same time, there's also a class action lawsuit against some of the largest manufacturers, which is, probably going to take some time to resolve, but points to the inordinate amount of increase in that cost relative to other products. And so, we've found, some sticker shock from folks that maybe had a quote from just 3 or 4 years ago, or 2 or 3 years ago. And, that is in large part due to the equipment pricing having increased substantially. So, unsure. I mean, tariffs or other possibilities. There's all sorts of reasons for why, but that has been, a change that's been observed over the last few years that is worth noting. And then, yeah, I know there's probably someone else who's got some other thoughts that they're going to share with us as well, but those are some of the ones that come to mind. And then obviously, I guess the one other one I want to point out is just the change in, the COVID mentality of folks being at home. That was certainly a surge in terms of folks wanting to be comfortable in their own homes with a larger percentage of their time being spent at home. And so perhaps that started to dissipate a little bit. But at the same time, we have those hot days that Jared alluded to, and the need for finding comfort in one's home. So those are some of the things that I wanted to highlight.
Thanks, Nick.
Sure.
a question for Shannon. Shannon, you are an energy navigator. You work with a lot of different clients. And can you tell us a little bit about what motivates the people you're working with to want to install heat pumps and what are some of the challenges there?
Sure. Um, so Energy Navigators has been in approximately a little over 250 homes in the past 2 years. And we've been in households of all income levels. And what we're hearing is people are motivated by cost and comfort, like that's at the top of their list. And then climate seems to be coming in like third place. So we meet people where they're at. Um, and I think some of the challenges for talking with people about installing heat pumps is the layout that they have in their home sometimes doesn't seem as conducive to heat pumps being the primary source of heat. But also if a house hasn't been weatherized, we talk to people about weatherization first so that then the heat pump can handle the heat load. That's something we talk to people about prior to getting a heat pump so that that heat pump works the way they expect it to work. Because that heat does feel different than some of the other heat sources that we have in Vermont here. Upfront costs is a barrier, as Nick alluded to. That is sometimes a barrier for households, is how do we afford to put in a couple heat pumps? The need for an electrical service upgrade or a panel upgrade, so then that also adds to the cost, right? So these are some challenges. People not knowing what a heat pump is, people not knowing how a heat pump works, people not knowing how to maintain a heat pump. These are all things that kind of get in the way. So I've been in homes where someone will have a heat pump and not have used it because they don't have the manual or they were never taught how to use it. Um, and recently we put out an advertisement on Front Porch Forum kind of talking about what service we provide, and it's a no cost service, and someone took us up on it, and I visited that home, and this person had a small condo. They had a heat pump installed directly over their propane unit that was heating the condo. And they called us because their propane unit had died, and now they realized they had to figure out how to use this heat pump. It'd been on the wall for 3 years. They didn't know how to use the remote. And so what we did was we sat down with them and we got them a manual. We sat down and talked to them through all of the various settings on the remote. We linked them to an article that Efficiency Vermont has published on best practices for heat pumps. Um, and then we provided them with kind of a recommended maintenance schedule, which included kind of the do-it-yourself cleaning of the filters, when to get a professional to come in and do a full cleaning. Um, and then we connect them with a few contractors that do heat pump cleanings. So it's right there. They know they can, when they're ready to do that, they have the information that they need. So what we found out in that particular case is the heat pump is right sized to take care of all the heating needs in that condo. Um, and the client, after the visit, has expressed to us how relieved that they are that they have a heat source that they can depend on and they don't know how to use, um, and that they don't have to spend money to replace the propane unit. So this was an example of where a heat pump was already installed, just not being used, just because of lack of education.
It's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that story, Shannon, and all of that information. I'm going to move on to Ken. Ken, you have heat pumps installed in your home that you've monitored closely. And I also know that you're very interested in how to get people to utilize the heat pumps they already have installed in their homes more comprehensively. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I apologize, my camera's broken, but maybe that's to everyone's benefit. I just want to add one more C to Shannon's cost, climate, and comfort, and that's convenience. But I want to go through those four because the cost piece is actually can be very objectively described. Objectively, but it is a little complicated. most other heating sources, or maybe all other heating sources, have a fixed price per million BTU. Heat pumps don't. The price per million BTU changes, as we know, as it gets colder, the efficiency of the heat pump declines, therefore the cost increases. But later we'll show a table that shows in most cases, especially for fuel oil and propane, at current and even recent costs of those fuels, the use of a heat pump on a cost per million BTU basis is cost effective. Now, this is again, my focus is entirely on existing heat pumps. The cost issue with regards to installing a new heat pump, you have to take that capital cost and balance it with the change in fuel costs. But in those cases, in our 80,000 cases of heat pumps that have been installed, the operational costs largely, not entirely, but largely are captured by the difference in fuel price. And again, depending upon the temperature, you can see the difference between the savings of using a heat pump versus the use of other fuels, and we'll get to that. So I say that's fairly objective, but a little complicated. And maybe one or two other angles to throw here is I know that in terms of the communication about heat pumps, we often talk about the average. And, going back to our microeconomics 101, consumers should make decisions on make marginal decisions, not average. And this makes a little bit of a difference here because there may be some times there are some times when the cost effectiveness of a heat pump is not sufficient to use it. And if you can identify those small number of hours during the year, not use the heat pump, it actually improves the average cost difference for using the fuel. So that's this marginal thing. And then the other part goes back, I was raised in the 70s during the first oil crisis. And at that time, at least in my memory, the whole idea of setback thermostats. And there's been a lot of study and a lot of people questioning their effectiveness because, every time you turn them down, doesn't it take more energy to heat them up? The physicists really clarified this, setback thermostats save energy. Okay. Now, again, complicated with heat pumps. And we'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the convenience part. So again, the little bit of variation from just a straight description of cost are some of these other factors. And I'll just say, talking to us here is one thing. We can talk about complication. I know that complicated arguments, complicated descriptions are hard for consumers. And so I'm hoping, and I joined this work group after the EAN annual meeting, I'm hoping that somebody can help with the communication aspect to include the fact that there are some factors that need to be included, but do it in a fashion that consumers can readily understand. And, the simple cost piece is above a certain temperature, it always makes sense to use your heat pump. Okay. And again, it's going to depend if you're a natural gas customer or a fuel oil propane customer or what that point is, but that can be, that can be a message out there that that may be effective and really can be driven home. But I leave that to experts. The second piece is terms of carbon and climate, and this one's also objective, but much more complicated because what you need to do is consider the carbon inputs for electricity. And while certainly in the regulatory realm, we have established numbers necessary to evaluate programs and provide incentive payments, unfortunately, that it does those numbers are variable, and it gets to an even more complex sort of economic thing in terms of marginal cost. Because you can say, and I never want to say this, into the general public, but on the margin in the winter, almost all of the decisions of electricity supply are going to be higher carbon. But because we have literally thousands and thousands and thousands of heat pumps, you can't add thousands and thousands and thousands of marginal decisions and not affect the the electric supply situation as determined by the electric utilities. In other words, if they know that there's going to be a demand at certain temperatures, they have the longer term, they establish their longer term contracts. Those longer term contracts have much less of the carbon impact than the moment by moment. So again, that's really complicated. But again, and again, it gets back to the costing. In most cases, the use of a heat pump has a beneficial carbon footprint compared to the use of fuel oil, natural gas, propane. Okay, and again, it may be a policy discussion and not a consumer discussion about are there instances, and it may be a very small number of hours during the year, are there instances where the heat pump should be utilized less? And is there some way? And I'm hoping for the day that the utilities have the opportunity to control our heat pumps, especially when we have other sources of heat in the home, so that they can, for their cost purposes, but also for their carbon purposes, identify those times and say, hey, we're slowing down the heat pump. So again, carbon and climate is an objective criteria, but even more complicated. The next two are subjective, and it's comfort and convenience. And with regards to comfort, I have a few factors that are important. And one is, and it's not unique for heat pumps. Many, many, many homes in Vermont have point sources of heat. Certainly the wood stove, but also we talked about the condo with the propane burner. You know, the Rinnai is the one we see an awful lot of. Those are wall units that are point sources of heat. People have been living with them for decades. And so, you know, the unfortunate part of a point source is it establishes a temperature gradient in your house, which is why central heat, you know, really was beneficial and seemed as optimal for folks because it minimized that temperature gradient between the source of the heat and different points around the house. So, and the other thing to know about the temperature gradient is the temperature gradient increases when it gets really cold. So when it's really cold, if you have the heat pump going, the room in which the heat pump is may still be adequate, but for folks, this is the comfort issue for folks that say, yeah, but far away from it, the house gets pretty cold, recognized. And again, though, it gets back to this, you know, the overall theme. There are times of the year when that temperature gradient is minimal and people are used to it. And so there are times of the year when the heat pump is absolutely adequate. And then the last one is convenience. And this one, and I know it's what people have, in terms of communication, continually having to manage your heat pump is not convenient. Recognize that. And again, that sort of messaging thing, wouldn't know how to do it, but the fact that people have managed their thermostats and their heating systems in many cases, if they are willing to try to optimize the use of the heat pump, they can make those sort of day-by-day decisions about the operation of the heat pump. So anyway, those are the things, and then we'll get back to some of my specific details in the house where I've monitored the daylights out of the house.
Thanks, Ken. Our final speaker today is Charlie. Charlie, you work for Evernorth on affordable multifamily buildings, and a lot of our conversation today is about single family, but what's different when we're thinking about heat pumps for multifamily housing?
Sure. I mean, I think in the context I work, the first thing that really comes to mind is typically when we're installing heat pumps, we're talking about either new construction or a pretty large scale and deep renovation of the project. So some of the issues that other people have spoken about thermal envelope and can a heat pump actually meet the load, those are not really concerns in the projects that we're working in because we're sort of starting from a blank slate, right? So we have an idea of what the heating cooling system will be in the building. We have an envelope design. We can match those two things, right? So we're working with low heating and cooling load buildings. It's a great application for a heat pump, and we're doing that without a backup heat source. So sort of like one of the questions that came up, I think, of like, how do you increase adoption? Well, this is not the answer everywhere, but if you have no other source of heat, you will figure out how to use the one you have, right? Like that's just a fact of life. I wouldn't recommend it if you're not sure if it's going to work, but in the context in which we're working, like that is a reality. The other thing, and Jared spoke about this a little bit with the increase number of extreme heat days, is just that I think air conditioning has really become a necessity in multifamily buildings, right? If you think about a single family home, if it cools off at night, you can typically open windows on more than one side of the building. You may be able to get some cross breeze and take advantage of some of that nighttime cooling. In a double loaded corridor multifamily building, you can open your windows, but you may only have windows on one side of your living unit. You're going to get very little air movement through your space. It's going to be very difficult to cool that off. And even if you were to do so, if everyone else that's surrounding you doesn't do the same thing, you're not going to be effectively cooling that space. So heat pumps are sort of like a wonderful solution to check those two boxes, right? It's a very low energy usage, and it provides air conditioning, which is increasingly necessary. I think the challenges come in when you think about how we actually end up delivering that. And in our projects, we're typically looking at a one-to-one heat pump installation, right? So when I say that, I mean we'll have one compressor for every living unit and typically one head in the living unit or one air handler, just depending on the layout of the space and the number of bedrooms and things of that. It's typically been exceptionally effective at heating and cooling the entirety of the space. But let's say you think about a 24-unit building. Before we adopted heat pumps, you would maybe have two boilers in that building that'd be feeding some baseboard radiation throughout the living units, right? When you go to one-to-one heat pumps, all of a sudden you're looking at one heat pump for every living space. And on top of that, you're adding a few for the common areas, right? So we're adding the amenity of air conditioning, which we wouldn't have without this. But then on the flip side of that, we're really increasing the number of systems within the building that need to be maintained. And so, we heard about people learning to change filters, right? Well, in the multifamily context, you have a service provider, whether that be our local partner or a mechanical contractor, who's going to come out and is going to clean those filters within the units, right? So that needs to be done. Even if you only do that every 6 months, that's twice a year that you need to provide service to that unit. And then every one of those units also needs a cleaning, say, every 18 months or 2 years, right? So we went from maintaining maybe two pieces of equipment in the building to maintaining 24 plus pieces of equipment in the building. And that does represent a real cost change, right? And it also means we have to find service providers to do that work. It means we have to get access to the living units that much more frequently to do that. And then at the end of life, we also have to replace all that equipment. And so we go from a few boilers that are tied to maybe some baseboard radiation, which would likely stay, to a situation in which we're replacing all those heat pumps and potentially dealing with a refrigerant change and the implications of that. So I think that's big picture. It's really like a question of scale. And well, you may have some marginal cost changes if you're looking at a single family home. When you multiply the marginal cost changes by 24 units, right, they start to add up. And so you just need to look at that really carefully and think through those implications.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to go back to Nick and Shannon. I'm going to ask them both the same question. Maybe Nick, you can answer first, and Shannon, you can add on. My question is, what are some of the scenarios you find when working with potential clients on installing heat pumps, and what are some of their misconceptions?
Sure. So overall, I'd say Vermonters are pretty well versed in the technology and the benefits provided. As a whole, pretty environmentally conscious, and so there is a lot of interest in heat pumps and what they bring to the table. Some of the more challenging aspects that pertain to they are obviously the electrification aspect of it, and so There are certainly some challenges working through that and determining, if the service feeding the house has enough amperage. And that's actually been one of the more challenging aspects of design and, determining, suitability and viability for projects. There's already a fair amount of expense, obviously, with installing heat pumps and the fact that, it's limited to the area that it's covering. There are obviously air handlers and other ways to disseminate the benefits of it as well. But that's certainly been something from an education standpoint that we end up playing that role for as a contractor. And I also think it's one where as folks look to do these projects is to kind of understand, some contractors don't deal with the electric disconnects for the outdoor condenser, and so there is the logistics of coordinating that that can be challenging, and then just getting up to speed in terms of it needs to be. A load calculation may need to take place, and just figuring out the logistics for projects. That has been something that when someone's first looking at heat pumps, that's not even a consideration. And so that's something that playing that education role and getting up to speed on pretty quickly for the customer and the end user, from what we found. The Yeah, and so the other aspects that I think are of interest are, the concept of it is a large investment and kind of being able to look at what your various options are. And not every contractor is going to bring the same things to the table. So, design, was talked about, and being able to have the right size units. So there's a lot of education that takes place as part of our, working with end users. And so they're, getting up to speed pretty quickly, whereas they're just focused on the benefit provided by and the desire to have cooling and then heating and reducing carbon footprint. So there's a lot of logistics that do take place and a lot of education that takes place through the course of working with them.
Thanks, Nick. We run into some similar questions. Uh, like some of the scenarios that when we're talking to people about their home as as a whole, and they're interested in heat pumps. Some people are interested in like, what do I do when my oil boiler is at the end of its life? Like, so we're looking at like, what are my options for replacing a whole system like that? Other clients are looking at, I have a cold office, or I want to address a really cold bedroom upstairs, but it's also really hot in the summer, and that's the main bedroom where, we occupy that space. So they're just looking to, kind of do certain places in the home. But some misconceptions that people have that we hear in conversation is, heat pumps only work down to, 25, 30 degrees. What am I going to do after that? Another misconception is that heat pumps can't take on the entire heating load. And we have conversations about, well, how could that, how could weatherization help that? And maybe this is a home that is absolutely true, but maybe it's not. So we have those kind of conversations. People really are concerned about aesthetics too. They've seen heat pumps, they know what they look like, and they think they're that big unit on the wall, close to the ceiling, and that's their only option. And they don't want it. And so talking to them about that there are other options out there, the way it's delivered. And then another misconception is that my electric bill is going to be completely unaffordable. Like I'm going to be using way too much and it's going to cost way too much. So those are the kind of things we hear. And I told Kara and Jared that I would be telling a few stories today. So because I'm on the ground, and our organization is talking to homeowners and renters. So I had a Brandon client who had worked through Brock and got her home weatherized about 7 years ago. And she was looking to kind of see how she could add heat pumps now that she had weatherization done to a few spots, a living room that opened up to a kitchen and kind of an upstairs area. And so we talked her through these kind of things that I had just talked about, like some of the misconceptions and stuff, and started the education process a little bit. And she was really interested. So we connected her to three contractors, and she had all three come out, and she chose one. We connected her to the current uh, rebate. So that she knew what it was for heat pumps with Efficiency Vermont, and she also qualified for the income bonus with GMP. So this is something that sort of moved her to say, oh, this might be something I can afford to do. And then we also connected her with the home energy loan option, and just giving her all these options so that she could make an informed decision on the project. So she got two heat pumps installed. Um, and now she's reporting that she's comfortable in her house, like in different seasons. And she was able to do it within her budget. Um, and she just needed a little guidance along the way. What had been holding her up was like she didn't know a contractor. She actually didn't know that she qualified for an additional income bonus. And she didn't know that the home energy loan was an option. I don't think she ended up doing the home energy loan, but at least she knew it was an option to cover kind of upfront costs. Um, so that's like a successful story. And but there's lots of people out there that have lots of misconceptions about what a heat pump can do, and just being able to talk to them even before they reach out to a contractor can be really helpful for them then to kind of get past that barrier to make that phone call to a contractor.
Thanks, Nick and Shannon. Charlie, I'm going to jump back over to you. I'm curious what the residents of the buildings you work with think of their heat pumps.
Yeah, I mean, I think my maybe glib answer is like, hopefully they don't think much about them at all. Honestly, hopefully the design, installation, uh, like maintenance is all done properly, and they are just living in a space that's warm when they want to be warm and cool when they want to be cool. I would say maybe in a little bit more detail, I do think if people are moving from a space in which they're used to a more like a radiant source of heat, like occasionally the fact that you're providing heat by moving air like more directly is something that takes a little getting used to. And if the design is not done properly, that moving air makes people feel cool. On the flip side of that, people really enjoy having air conditioning. I mean, think about a day like today, right? And if you're in a space and you're not moving around and you're sitting there, it can feel quite warm. So I think that's a huge boon, like really, really something that people value. The biggest challenge is probably education around the thermostats. If you're coming from a space in which you have a heating only thermostat, right, you're used to setting it to a temperature and that's it, and you walk away. And heat pump thermostats typically can be set up in one of a number of different ways and offer all kinds of different options from right, like dry mode, heating, cooling, auto, off, fan speed adjustment, vane, et cetera, right? So we do our best to try to start that setup up in a place where people can understand it and then provide education. But I do think there is some learning curve that goes along with, okay, hey, you're going from one system to another, and how do you use that effectively such that you can feel comfortable in your space? And then I think like lastly, right, there is some amount of maintenance that goes along with having a heat pump. There are filters that need to be cleaned. That's not unique only to heat pumps, but it is a little different than some other systems, and that does require someone to go into their living unit and like provide that maintenance. And so that's just something that, right, like people have to be aware of, and I think that's probably something that they don't really enjoy. But otherwise, I think really like having air conditioning probably balances out almost all of those other challenges for people, right? It's like a pretty silent and nice way to do that as opposed to a window unit, which occasionally fall out or break or, take your pick.
Great, thanks, Charlie. Okay, we're going to go back to Ken. Now, Ken shared some slides with us. My colleague Luke is going to share those as Ken talks through a little bit more of the details that he has pulled out.
Sure. So here are those 4 Cs. Let's go to the cost one because this table. I know Jared kind of asked for this at at an organizational meeting. So on the left is the cost per million BTU for a heat pump at a few different temperatures and at different prices for electricity. And all this again is dollars per million BTU, which will then compare with the various combustion fuels on the right. And again, it's, I initially did this work several months ago where prices were significantly lower for propane and fuel oil. So, you can just, it's easy math to expand this table to get people to what their actual cost is for their combustion source. But what you can do then is when you pick your combustion source and your price, you then look over and say, okay, at what temperature does it cost less to operate my heat pump than it does to burn my fuel? And again, I know this is complicated for folks that don't like numbers and don't like to have to calculate that sort of thing. But it is, from a microeconomics 101, this is how you're supposed to make decisions. And okay, so let's go to the next one. This is even more complicated, and I don't want to get involved a lot in disputing the numbers. I just picked 3 different sets of electric generation carbon numbers, and then you run the coefficient of performance of a heat pump through them to get how much carbon is put out per million BTU. And you can see for the category 1 and 2, at essentially every temperature, you're still carbon effective against the fossil products. And again, the far right column is wood, and I know we can have a huge discussion about what the proper number for wood is, and I'm not actually suggesting this is one. It's just one that the state uses. And in my case, I wood pellets is my backup source of heat. So, in my own mind, I kind of have a number. It's actually a little higher than this, so that again, the point is in many, many cases, it is better to use the heat pump than it is to use the combustion source. So complicated, I understand, but it is knowable if you consider the assumptions that are behind the choice of electric generation. Okay, let's go to the next, which is, I think, more about me. I mentioned the temperature gradient. The other thing that it has to do with comfort, and this is related to setback thermostats, is what I call the catch-up capacity. When you cool a house down, which my wife and I cool our house down at night, every night, we always have, we always will, because we like to sleep in a cooler house. That means we need to warm the house up. And with the heat pump, there are certain times of the year where the heat pump is sufficient to do to get the house right back to where we want it at the time we want it. And then when it's really cold, we need our other source of heat. And that's fine. But again, that's this part. And to understand what you need is, again, pretty complicated. But with experience, you can kind of figure it out. And this third one about fan air move, the air movement and noise thing. It's not our issue. We don't even know when we don't hear our heat pump register at all. And we're not, somehow the fact that it moves air just doesn't seem to make much difference to us. So it's just not our issue, but I know it is, and I don't know, I guess the sort of thing you get used to it. Okay, so I think the next one is a picture of our house. Oh no, this is just some numbers in terms of catch up. I picked a specific example, which is very dramatic, and that is if I want to heat the house for 1 degree when it's 20 degrees outside, it takes about 3 hours, and that's a long time. But if I go to 30 degrees, in other words, when the outdoor temperature is 30 degrees, it cuts that by it's way less than an hour, because again, it's the extra heat that you get from the heat pump beyond what you need just to maintain the heat in a building. That's what that first sentence is. It requires, in my case, 13,500 BTUs to maintain the house at 65 when it's 20 degrees outside. And because we have an 18,000 BTU register, then we only have 4,500 BTUs to heat the house, to increase the temperature in the house. And if it takes another 13.5 to get that degree, then it's going to take 3 hours. Okay. Again, that's just an example, but you'll also see what we do is we have a combustion source. Combustion source typically on a cold day operates between 6 and 9 in the morning, brings the house up to the temperature we want, and then the pellet boiler's off, and the heat pump maintains the heat the rest of the day. Again, complicated, but this is important. This is, I initiated this work because of the Public Service Department study and beforehand hearing so many people won't use their heat pump. And so we need to understand what it is that's behind their reasons. Okay, let's go to the next one. I talked about this temperature gradient. Let's go to the next picture. So this is my house. This is the first floor of my house. And you'll see the heat pump there on the upper left. That's where the register, an 18,000 BTU register is. And I direct, as we talk about, you direct the vane. I blow as much as I can to the right, which is towards the living room. The A, B, and C are 3 recording thermometers that I have that give me a sense of what the temperature is when I change things. The T in the middle of the house, that's where the thermostat for my boiler is. And I had to move it because it was in the breakfast room. And because the heat pump was there, I didn't want the thermostat to be affected by the heat pump, so I tucked it around a corner. But you can get a sense from this. There's going to be a temperature gradient, and it's greater when it's really cold out. The breakfast room is always going to be the warmest. The living room is going to be in the middle, and the dining room is going to be the coldest. So next picture. So this is in the middle of November. All I use is the heat pump at this point. And you can see the 3 different temperatures. The gray line is my breakfast room. The blue line is the living room, that middle one, and then the orangish brown line is the dining room, where you can always see, and this 3-day period, temperature in the mid-30s. It's about 2-degree difference between the living room and the dining room. And you've heard me say, I like my setback thermostat. I like to turn it down at night. And when you do, you see the temperatures decline and then turn the heat pump up. And there's a little bit of a lag from, the breakfast room warms up earlier. And this, this is a specific example. There's other examples, but it takes a little bit of a time for the rest of the house to recover. But the breakfast room itself warms up rather quickly. So in the morning we have breakfast. We're warm as we want to be, and then the house continues to recover. And then at bedtime, turn it down, and you can see the house goes down. So this is just heat pump. Okay, let's see the next one. And so I can do this stuff because I have, and for anyone who's a geek, I have circuit monitors, conductance transducers in my service panel that monitor the minute by minute, or for most statistical purposes, hour by hour use of electricity. And so for that time period I was just doing, this is what is actually the draw and therefore the heat output from the heat pump. So you can see where I turned it down a little before midnight on the left, and then it doesn't go to 0. I don't entirely understand how the heat pump works, to be quite honest. So it's still putting out heat. And then when I turn it up a little, it's probably about 8 in the morning there's an increase in the utilization of electricity and therefore the heat that comes out of it. And again, turn it down again in the evening in the late evening there. I think I may also have turned on a pellet stove at about 6 p.m. so that the demand for the heat pump goes down. Next. So this is kind of the bottom line. So I have heat pump, I have a pellet, I have both a pellet boiler and pellet stove, but I just kind of sum them for the amount of heat that I get from them. I also have a heat pump hot water heater, and we'll look at that in a second. And you can see this is the 24-25 heating season. And you can see in total, it's about 60 million BTUs for the house. of which 35 plus comes from the heat pump. 20 comes from pellets. And I said 35.6 goes heat pump for space heat. Another 4.5 is for hot water. If you look at the heat pump hot water, my domestic hot water comes off of the pellet boiler. So that when the pellet boiler is on, which is largely December through early March, then the heat pump still has to operate to maintain temperature in the tank. But you'll see that it dropped very significantly from November to December because I turned on the heat pump. I turned on the pellet boiler, and then goes up again in March when I turn the pellet boiler off. And then you see the other fluctuation as we go March, April, May, June, it declines because the temperature of the basement where my heat pump hot water heater is going up. So it doesn't require as much juice. But anyway, this is just a table of how much electricity I use. And again, I want people to use their heat pumps more. I'm elderly. My wife likes to keep the house warm. We keep our house warm. And in this 24, 25 heating degree season day, 40 out of our 60, so 2/3 of our heat came from a heat pump, a single compressor, 24,000 BTU compressor. We do have two heads, but the upstairs head we don't use. We do not add any heat to our upstairs because that's the way we like it. So 2/3 of our heat comes from a single-headed heat pump. And then we go to 25, 26, the next one. It was colder, but this is getting heavily geeky. We'll get just a little more heavily geeky. Essentially, it's the same sort of result. 2/3 of the electricity comes from the heat pump, but the amount of heat we utilized or generated during this 25, 26 season is significantly higher, more than would be suggested by heating degree days. And again, I play with my system, so I want to try to figure out, and I think the next chart shows what I've been doing to see how to optimize my system. So the next chart. So this is in 24, 25 what I used to do, and again the same November 13. I turned the heat pump off when I went to bed, which is why the output goes to 0. In other words, I took the thermostat and hit the power switch on it, and it turned it off. And you can see the upper is just what happens to the temperature in the house. And then it's a programmable thermostat, but it's only programmable to turn on and off. So I had it turn on just before we wake up, and you can see the temperature begins to recover. Okay, so that's what I did in November 24. Then we go next one. Next slide.
Hang tight. It's
stuck. Okay.
Yeah, that's the last one we've got, Ken.
Oh, okay. Because in 25, what I did instead of turning the heat pump off, I turned it down so that and you don't need to go back, but you remember that when I turn it down, it's still putting out a significant amount of heat. And I don't understand why, but it does. And that may be the reason why I utilized more heat in this recent heating season than I did the year before, because I'm using the heat pump more, not allowing, if that's the right word, the temperature in the house to decline as much. But we were never unhappy with the rebound temperature. And these are the November one. It's just heat pump. We weren't using the pellet boiler. So I'm curious. So I think I'm gonna go back, especially during shoulder season, October, November, March, April, May, turn heat pump off when I go to bed at night and have it turn itself on at 6 in the morning. And that might be a way to increase the efficiency a little bit. But I went through that slide that showed our overall use. We are able to heat our house very cost effectively, and even in the coldest months, I guess it's not there. I have a table that talks about the dollars per BTU. For the heat pump use, it never goes above $25 a million BTU. Okay, because I don't use it when it's really cold. Because I'm happy with my pellet boiler. I'm happy with the temperature gradient that's maintained by using the central heat early in the morning. and by not using it at the coldest temperatures, I'm able to get, say from my perspective, the most cost-effective utilization of the heat pump. So that's my story. And again, complicated. I understand. Never going to take this out to the public. But if there's some messages about how to really help people, and if we start with the cost one, whenever the temperature is above 10 degrees, it is probably almost always best to have your heat pump on. Oh, and one more thing, and I know there are, I don't know, messages or stories you hear out there. Running your heat pump at the same time you're running your combustion source, I think is fine. My heat pump is always putting out heat. And just because my boiler's on at 7 in the morning doesn't mean my heat pump can't be putting out some heat and making my boiler work a little less. And again, I've heard folks that have this belief that when you turn your heat pump on, you turn your boiler off, and vice versa. I don't think that's necessary, and I think that may be a complication that we don't need to utilize. But you can keep that heat pump running even while your combustion source is operating. Now, location of thermostat's important, but again, that's one of my pieces of the story. And when I work with other people, yeah, keep your furnace on. Just have the heat pump do as much work as it can. So
Thanks for
that's
that,
my
Ken.
story.
We are slightly over time at this point. If any of you can stay with us for a couple more minutes, including our speakers, I realize you might have to jump, but I did want to give our four speakers the chance, if anyone wants to make a brief comment on, from your experience, what might help Vermonters to utilize heat pumps more for heating and to continue having people install these in their homes. If anyone wants to give a brief comment on that before we jump off.
Yeah, I'll go. I think education on whole home systems and heat pumps in general, how to use them, cost comparisons like Ken is talking about, efficiency comparisons, all that kind of information in ways that the general public can, see it and understand it. Higher rebates, that moves people. We know that moves people. So higher rebates for heat pumps, promoting success stories for all income levels. And my last plug would say add more navigators across the state.
Thanks, Shannon. Does anyone else want to jump in with a quick thought about that?
I'll just add one thing. I'm hoping that policy over the next few years allows for the electric utility rate to match the marginal cost of electricity, so that people can get an even greater price signal to use their heat pumps, especially during the shoulder season. The shoulder season is a time when electricity costs are relatively low, and to absolutely optimize the use of heat pumps during the shoulder seasons to get that price signal from the utilities might be a real benefit, and not just monetarily, but also the public discussion about it. It can be in the news. Say, hey, did you know that they're considering giving a heat pump rate that allows people to utilize their heat pump at an even lower cost?
Nick or Charlie, do you want to chime in?
I mean, I think in the multifamily realm, heat pumps or some similar technology is pretty much leading the way just because of the need for air conditioning. I do think as much as possible, at least in new construction, right, you're building with an envelope that allows you to use this piece of technology. And so it sort of just like naturally lends itself to that. But at the same time, when it's your only option, that's what you use. So as much as we can move towards that, I think that would be helpful.
I think mirroring what others have said, the dollars and cents piece, especially as you are outside of the natural gas territory, the cost benefit is a good motivator. The one caveat too is just to be aware of, if you have hydronic system, we have some really cold temperatures, and you do need to be aware of where your baseboards are For the really cold temperatures, if you turn off your boiler completely in those scenarios and yet you have water in areas that may be, prone to freezing, just be aware of that, especially those negative temperatures, just to be aware of that. We do find customers, every winter that encounter that, whether it's a wood stove that's acting as a primary and a hydronic as a backup, or heat pumps. So just be aware of that.
Thank you all so much. This has been really interesting. I'm sorry we didn't get around to Q&A from the audience, but we had too many people with too much good information to share. So we will share the recording of this, and we'll look forward to some more conversation. And I hope you all have a great day. Thanks for joining us.